Today, there are 1.8 million Christians in Myanmar, the country previously known as Burma. When America's first foreign missionary arrived there in 1813, there were none. Adoniram Judson and his young wife Anne set out from New England in 1812, originally planning to work in India. The East India Trading Company controlled access to the subcontinent. Because the company believed that additional missionaries might lead to agitation among native peoples, the Judsons were refused permission to work in India. Burma was a far riskier destination because of its despotic government, an ongoing war with neighboring Siam, and its primitive living conditions. Even the famous missionary to India, William Carey, cautioned the Judsons against moving there. Adoniram Judson ignored that advice and spent 38 years working among the Burmese, becoming the father of the Christian church there. He was a gifted linguist, translating the entire Bible into Burmese and completing a dictionary that was used by missionaries for decades. His example encouraged countless Western disciples to become missionaries and to take the gospel to other dangerous lands. Judson's success came at a staggering cost. After leaving America in 1812, he never saw his parents again. It was 6 difficult years before they saw their first Burmese convert, and another 12 years before there was a real harvest of disciples. When Britain attacked Burma in 1824, all Westerners were arrested as suspected spies. Adoniram spent 17 months in prison, at times on the brink of death. Less than a year after he was released, his wife Anne died at age 37. All 3 of the children born to Adoniram and Anne likewise died. Adoniram spent the next 4 years in a paralyzing depression, lamenting his life and feeling distant from God. In the midst of that dark time, he wrote, "God is to me the great unknown. I believe in him, but I find him not." The depression lifted just before the outpouring of the new Burmese disciples began in 1831. 8 years after his first wife's death, Adoniram married Sarah Boardman, a missionary widow. They worked side by side with the fledgling Burmese church. Together they had 8 children, but only 5 survived childhood. After 11 years of marriage, Sarah also died. Adoniram endured the loss of his second wife without descending into depression. In fact, he remarried the following year. Emily Chubbuck was a well-known New England writer when she left everything to join Judson in Burma. They enjoyed 4 happy years of marriage before Adoniram himself died in 1850. Emily returned to America only to die of tuberculosis 3 years later. During her 40 years of missionary service, Mary Slessor was instrumental in bringing the gospel to 2 unreached people groups in West Africa. Her bold preaching led to thousands of new disciples and hundreds of churches. She saved uncounted lives by brokering peace accords between rival tribes. As a direct result of her intervention, courts of justice replaced traditional cycles of revenge. She rescued and reared hundreds of abandoned orphans. Slessor healed the sick and taught public health principles. She helped eliminate deadly superstitious practices. Mary Slessor's accomplishments rival those of Hudson Taylor, William Carey, or any other missionary hero. But those accomplishments came at great personal expense. After leaving her native Scotland at age 29, she only had 1 furlough home during a career that spanned 40 years. She never married or had children of her own. She suffered innumerable episodes of malaria and other life-threatening tropical diseases. She faced disapproval from other missionaries who thought her too reckless. Isolated from most basic comforts, she was familiar with leopards, poisonous snakes, and other deadly animals. The climate was unbearable at times. Adoniram Judson and Mary Slessor are only 2 examples of committed disciples who endured intense suffering as a result of their obedience to Jesus. From the beginning of the Christian movement, hardship and pain have been familiar to disciples of Jesus, especially those who dared to bring the gospel to previously unreached people. Even today, there are countless disciples who face imprisonment, torture, and even death because of their willingness to live faithfully in enemy-controlled territory. The pattern of God's servant's suffering is so common in the Bible that we overlook it. Consider Joseph. After being rejected by his own brothers, he was sold into slavery. Despite being upright, he endured years of unjust imprisonment as a prelude to his eventual fruitfulness. King David, despite being a man after God's own heart, lived for years with a price on his head. Forced to hide among outcasts in caves and mountain camps, he was under constant threat of death. Several of the Psalms record the frustration, fear, and despair he faced before God eventually vindicated him. Daniel and his fellow exiles were forcibly removed from their homeland and their families. Living as slaves in a foreign land, they were forced to change their language, their dress, even their names. Their good conduct was rewarded with jealousy and treachery. When they refused to dishonor God, they faced wild beasts and ravenous fire. Their willingness to endure obediently resulted in God being glorified by Gentile rulers. In the New Testament, Paul, the first great missionary of the church, faced imprisonment, beatings, stonings, shipwrecks, and wild animals, not to mention hunger and homelessness. Church tradition holds that he was eventually beheaded for his unwillingness to worship the Roman emperor. Paul's endurance, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, led to the gospel spread throughout the Roman world and beyond. It's not